Okay, the question was asked on the type 1 and type 2 errors and powers of error or errors. How do you find the p-value? How do you know if you should just use p of z is less than or equal to your critical value, or if you should use 1 minus p of z is less than or equal to? Normally when you are doing your test, you follow what your alternative hypothesis is, less than, greater than, or not equal to. But in this one, the wording is a little different. You have to pay attention to if you have a type 1 error, type 2 error, if you're doing the power test, or exactly how the question is worded. So it's a little tougher than the other ones are. So first, just to remind you, if you are doing a left-tailed test where your alternative hypothesis is the mean is less than something, if you look at my drawing there, that means the alternative hypothesis will be to the right of the critical value and your null hypothesis would be to the left of the critical value. If you are doing a right-tailed test where your alternative hypothesis is a greater than, then your null hypothesis is going to be to the left and your alternative hypothesis would be to the right. When you do a two-tailed test, you have two different critical values, and so then again it's hard to tell, should I do 1 minus or should I not do the 1 minus? It depends if your critical value is on the left or the right, which is hard to tell. So on the note sheets I gave you a hint on that, but I'm going to talk about that later. Also, depending on the question, it depends what the question is and what section of that you are trying to find. If you are doing a type 1 error, that means you're rejecting the null when in fact the null is true. So if you're rejecting the null, that means you would be accepting the null or the alternative hypothesis, and depending on which test it is, it might be to the left, it might be to the right, it might be both ways. Type 2 error is not rejecting the null, so you are accepting the null, again depending on which test it is, might be to the right, might be to the left. And then if you're doing the power test, that's the probability of accepting the alternative hypothesis, which means you're rejecting the null. So both the type 1 error and the power test is accepting the alternative hypothesis. The type 2 error is accepting the null. Sometimes the question just asks that. So I'm going to go back to questions number 10, 11, and 12 on the type 2 errors of powers, which is on homework 16, to just talk about the p-value parts of that. So first of all, if I grab the one from homework 10. So the part that's talking about the p-value and where you have to do that test says, assuming that the actual value of mean is $8.57, what is the probability that the union rejects the null hypothesis? So if you're rejecting the null, you're going to accept the alternative hypothesis. So I'm going to go back down to my drawing. This happens to be a right-tailed test. And so on my right-tailed test, I have my null on the left and my alternative hypothesis on the right. It wants to know what the probability is that you're going to reject the null. If you're going to reject the null, that means you're going to accept the alternative hypothesis. Since that's to the right, that's when you have to do the 1 minus p. So I found p of z is less than or equal to my critical value, but then I had to do 1 minus that value in order to get the p value, since I'm looking for the value that's on the right side of my critical value. If I go to number 11 here, number 11 says, assuming that the actual value of the mean is 6.75 ounces, what is the power of the test? So when you're doing the power of the test, you're rejecting the null, accepting the alternative hypothesis. If I look, my alternative hypothesis this time is a less than. So if I go down to my picture, that means that my alternative hypothesis is on the left, my null is on the right. The question wants to know what is the power test. So on the power test, we are accepting the alternative hypothesis, which is on the left. So since that's on the left, we don't need the 1 minus, we just do the p of z is less than or equal to our critical value, and we get our answer. So if the thing we're looking for is on the left, you just do the p of z. If it's on the right side, then we would do the 1 minus. So if in that case I was trying to find the null, I would have had to do the 1 minus. But since I'm trying to find the alternative, which is on the left, I'm going to just do the P of Z is less than or equal to my critical value. If I look at number 12, on number 12, it says, assuming that the actual value of the mean is 86, what is the probability that the psychologist commits a type 2 error? So again, a type 2 error means you failed to reject the null. So if you failed to reject the null, again, you're accepting the alternative hypothesis. This is a right-tailed test since I have a greater than. So if I go down to my picture, whoops, I am failing to reject the null. That means I accepted the null. If I failed to reject it, I accepted the null. So in this case, if I have my picture here, it is a right-tailed test. That means my null is going to be to the left side. My alternative hypothesis, which I didn't label, but is on the right side. But since it says I'm failing to reject the null, it means I'm accepting the null, and the null is on the left side. Since the null is on the left side of my critical value, then I just do the regular P of Z is less than or equal to my value. So again, if whatever you're looking for is on the left, you just do the P of Z. If it's on the right of the critical value, you do 1 minus. Now, if you happen to have a two-tailed test, it's kind of hard to tell if you're on the left or if you're on the right. So if you just do the P of Z is less than or equal to your value, if it ends up being a value that's more than 50%, more than half, you know it's not the right one, because when you double it, you still have to be less than 1. And so if you get a bigger number like 0.98 and you would double that, then you'd get 1 point something, you know that you want to do the 1 minus. That's, I guess, my best hint for you, because it's hard to tell when you get your critical value if it's the critical value that's on the left or the critical value on the right. Sometimes you have to just do the P of Z. Sometimes you have to do 1 minus. So if you get a bigger number that's more than 50%, you know when you double it, you're going to get a P value that's more than 1. Tells me, oops, I got to do it the other way, 1 minus. Hope that cleared that up. If you still have questions, let me know.